And I'd like to now introduce Lord John Krebs to come and talk about this wider environment of food and our understanding of it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So we're all very familiar with food. How do I get this to go forward next? We spend a lot of time eating it, eat about 1,000 meals a year, all of us. So we have strong opinions about the food we eat and what's in it and what's good for us and what's not good for us. We're also all the time bombarded with information in the press, in all sorts of media. Blueberries are superfoods, eat fat and grow thin, sugar is the new tobacco, and so on. And I want to talk about how we navigate through these competing claims and various claims in different forms of the media and come to sensible decisions about the food we eat. What I'm going to do to kick off with is set you all a little quiz. There are going to be no formal prize-giving awards, but you can keep a tally of how well you're doing yourself. So I'm going to show you a number of assertions, and you simply have to ask yourself, is the assertion true or is it false? So assertion number one, you'll often read that organic food is better for the environment, it's more sustainable. Is that true or false? What do you think? What do you think the evidence says? Well, the answer is it's not proven. There are certain arguments that you might think would lead to organic food being more sustainable, fewer inputs, less destruction of habitat, and so on. On the other hand, there are arguments that lead the other way. Organic production is typically somewhere between 50 and 70% per hectare of conventional production. So in order to produce food organically, if you produce the same amount of food, you need more land. And the worst thing we can do for both greenhouse gas emissions and loss of biodiversity is to turn wild land into agricultural land. So it's not clear-cut. Second exam question. There's quite a considerable amount of discussion in the press that artificial sweeteners like aspartame or saccharin, far from helping people to lose weight, actually encourage people to put on weight. This is a widespread story about them. Is that true or is it false? Answer is, and I'll come back to show you some evidence related to this, it's false. It's not a claim that's supported by scientific evidence. Exam question number 3. Does saturated fat increase your risk of cardiovascular disease? Should we all eating less butter, less saturated animal fat, and replace it with something else like polyunsaturated fat, sunflower oil instead of butter? Well, it's very contentious. There are lots of articles in the press that claim one or the other. And the summary of it is that it's probably true. How are you doing so far? 100%? Still more to answer. Moving on. If I can get this to work. Now, we heard from Julie that people are getting too fat around the world. I'll come back to this at the end of the talk. And is it because we're eating too much sugar, or is it because we're eating too much fat? Some people think that sugar is the villain, some people think that fat's the villain, some people think that calories are the villain. It doesn't matter where they come from. So what's the answer to that? What do you think the evidence shows? The evidence shows that it's not true that sugar is a bigger villain than fat. Stick with it. Still a little bit more time to go in the exam. So what about food dyes, so-called E numbers, like tartrazine, the yellow color that's put in certain sweets and soft drinks? When I had young daughters, there were many parents who would proudly say when we took our daughters to a birthday party, there will be no tartrazine at this party. It's all natural. There's nothing added. Because if we put tartrazine in, your daughters would come back flailing, mad, hyperactive kids. So is there any scientific evidence to support that? Well, when I was head of the Food Standards Agency, we actually commissioned a large randomized controls trial called the Southampton study, carried out at Southampton University, and unfortunately the evidence was inconclusive. So all we can say at this point is there is no conclusive evidence that colorants added to food cause hyperactivity in children. So there's your exam. I'm not going to ask you how many you got, but you'll all have your own score. But actually, rather than reflecting on your own score, you should be turning the question back on me. You should say, well, you're making these assertions, John. How do we know? What's the evidence? How reliable is it? And if different experts are saying different things, who should we trust? Why should we trust you rather than this professor of medicine at the University of Neesville who's published a paper saying that sugar is much worse than fat in terms of obesity? So the first step towards navigating these competing claims in the press is to understand something about the nature of evidence. In the case of food, a lot of the evidence comes from epidemiological studies. So either retrospective studies or prospective studies where you track cohorts of individuals and look at their diet and look at health outcomes. And of course, those studies are fraught with difficulties. For example, you do a study in which you track people who eat more saturated fat and look at their risk of getting cardiovascular disease. Well, question one, which direction does the cause-effect arrow go? Is it that people who are more at risk of cardiovascular disease also happen to like fat? Or is it that people who happen to like fat put themselves at greater risk of cardiovascular disease? You can't tell from simple correlations. It doesn't show the direction of causation. Perhaps people lied about what they eat anyway, because a lot of these studies rely on food diaries, and food diaries are notoriously unreliable. One experience I had visiting the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen, this is about 15 years ago, where subjects were kept in an enclosed bunker, an enclosed flat, and food was pushed in through a little window each day, and they had to record food diaries. And of course, at the end of the study, you could go in and check what food was left over. And people had written down they, for example, ate half a bar of chocolate a day, and then the experimenter would say, well, just a minute, we put in 5 bars of chocolate a day, and there's none of it left here. Oh, you have a point there. So even under controlled conditions, people don't necessarily recall or aren't inclined to tell you accurately what they've eaten. So epidemiological studies are important. They're a major source of evidence, but they have problems. There's also randomized control trials, and I'll show some evidence from those, which of course are generally seen as the gold standard in evidence on food and health. So you've taken randomly assigned individuals to treatment A or treatment B, more fat or less fat in their diet, more sugar or less sugar in their diet, and you look at measures, outcome measures like weight gain or possibly cardiovascular disease or whatever measure you're interested in. Of course, there are criticisms of those. Perhaps they're small samples, because they're difficult to conduct. Perhaps they're conducted for a short period of time, because you can't keep people chained to these RCTs for years on end, so they may last for a few months. And so even those have problems, and we need to interpret them with caution. So probably, in terms of what evidence is there, the gold standard would be a meta-analysis of multiple randomized controlled trials, and I'll give you one example of that. So often the evidence is fuzzy. And when I learnt science at school, science was a set of facts. So the atomic weight of sodium or Newton's laws of motion. But actually, when it comes to look at the scientific evidence relating to food and health or food and sustainability, often what we're looking at is evidence that is less than clear-cut, and we have to be cautious about navigating our way through it. So let me just go back to one of those. This is artificial sweeteners and obesity. Here are a bunch of articles, including one from Nature, sugar substitutes linked to obesity. At least the headline implies that there may be a linkage. artificial sweeteners may disrupt body's blood sugar controls, sweetness linked to rise in obesity and diabetes, etc. So what is the scientific evidence? Well, I've said that the gold standard is the randomized control trial, and this is a summary of a number of randomized control trials with relatively small sample sizes. But if you look at the very bottom, the bit that's called, oops, I've done something, I've made it go black. How do I get rid of that? There we go. This one at the bottom shows, favors low-calorie sweeteners, so losing weight favors the comparator. So these were people who gain weight on artificial sweeteners, and the overall summary is that people lose weight. So two things to take away from this. One is if you look at individual studies, there's quite a lot of variability. Here's a study you could pick out showing that artificial sweeteners make you gain weight. So you've got to look at the whole lot to get an overall picture. But then you might say this is replacing low-calorie soft drinks with sugary soft drinks, and the health freaks will say, well, surely it's better to replace them with water. So how do low-calorie sweetener drinks compare with water? This is only one study, but this shows a weight loss program in which you're looking at weight change as a function of time with people fed on the same amount of liquid, either in the form of water up here or in the form of a low-calorie sweetener such as aspartame or saccharin in their drinks. So just to give you a flavour of how the evidence can look when you start to dig into it. But looking at the evidence is not the only problem with how to present food risks or food benefits in public communication. Another important element is how do we talk about risk? And here's a headline from the Daily Express a few years ago. A daily fry-up boosts your cancer risks by 20%. Seems pretty scary, doesn't it? What this is talking about is the putative link between pancreatic cancer and the consumption of processed meat, like bacon or ham or sausages. Processed meats contain nitrates or nitrites, which are thought to be potential carcinogens and contribute to pancreatic cancer. So there was a study, not a large number of studies, that putatively showed this 20% increase in risk. Once you start to unpackage the story, it looks rather different. So here's an attempt to unpackage it. First thing is that how many people in the population unfortunately develop pancreatic cancer during their life? Roughly speaking, on average, it's about 5 out of every 400 people. If every one of those 400 people ate processed meat every day, and according to the expert opinion, it's at least 50 grams a day, one extra person would get pancreatic cancer. That's a 20% increase in risk, from 5 up to 6. That's what the Daily Express was talking about. So it looks bad. You don't want to increase your risk of cancer by any amount, but it doesn't look anything like as bad as 20% increase in risk. In fact, to express those numbers as a percentage, it's 0.25%. And that's eating 50 grams of bacon per day. And obviously, with any potentially harmful substance, there's a dose-response relationship. So if you eat less than 50 grams a day, the relative risk will be much smaller. So, where's the timer on this? I can't actually. Oh, there it is. Yeah, no, 6 minutes ago. So that's another side of the story about communicating about food is how do we communicate about risk. But even then, if the risk is 0.25% addition, is that big or is that small compared with the other risks that we face in our lives? If we want to compare risks, we need some kind of common currency in which to talk about them. And David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge University has suggested a common currency for comparing chronic risks. Both the risks we associate with our food are not risks that result in sudden death, although choking on food might be in that category. They're mostly risks that have a cumulative effect during our lifetime, either an accumulation of toxins or an accumulation of the effects of poor diet that Julie was telling us about a few minutes ago. And what David has argued is you can invent or create a common currency by thinking about your expenditure of the rest of your life. The average person in this country in their 20s has about a life expectancy of about a further 57 years. If you break that 57 years into half-hour blocks, that's 1 million half-hour blocks, 48 per day. And if you call a half-hour block a micro-life, then you have, in your 20s, you have roughly 1 million micro-lives to spend. But different things you do could increase or decrease your rate of expenditure. We're told that taking exercise regularly keeps us healthy for longer, so maybe that's a way of decreasing our expenditure of micro-lives. Smoking fags, we all know, decreases our life expectancy, in short, increases your expenditure of micro-lives. So here's a way of putting some lifestyle choices on a common currency scale. So eating fruit and veg, eating red meat, doing exercise, being overweight, and smoking cigarettes. So one day is 48 microlives. According to the scientific evidence we have, and with all the flaws that I've already talked about, eating 5 portions of fruit and veg a day will mean you only spend 44 microlives instead of 48. In contrast, being 5 kilograms overweight, you spend 51 microlives per day. So maybe if we want to ask, is a risk big or small, how does it compare, then we need some kind of currency of this kind to put things in perspective. So let me finally turn back to the point that Julie mentioned, that the real risks that we face with the food we eat are not to do with the pesticide residues, not to do with whether or not they can contain GMOs, not to do with whether they contain chemical additives, not to do with acrylamide, a potential carcinogen in our food. They're to do with the dietary contributions to the 2 major killers in most Western societies, heart and circulatory disorders and various kinds of cancer. And epidemiological evidence suggests that the risk of suffering from these chronic diseases is in part related to the diet we eat. Eating too much fat, too much salt, not enough fiber, not enough fruit and vegetables. So those are where the real risks, those are real killers, hidden killers in your food, are the contribution to chronic disease. And of course, again, as Julie mentioned, one of the manifestations of inappropriate eating is the epidemic of obesity. Amongst children, according to the World Health Organization, obesity has increased tenfold in the last 40 years, such that worldwide 1 in 5 children is now considered to be overweight or obese. Now, at one level, you might say it's very straightforward. People are becoming too fat because they eat more calories than they expend, and for all sorts of reasons. As Julie elegantly showed, we live in an environment where the tempting goodies that we're all programmed to love are rich in calories, fat or sugar. But there's a considerable debate in the literature, and it goes back to one of my early questions in the exam. Is the villain fat? Is the villain sugar? Or is the villain simply calories? And I made the assertion that it was not true that fat was worse, or that sugar was worse than fat. But let me just now show you some of the data. So again, these are randomized control trials, and there's a whole lot of them down here, which, if you take the average, adults put on weight with added sugar in the diet, and here's higher sugars in their diet, they put on more weight. So, sugar is after all the villain. But you think, well, what's actually wrong with those studies? They haven't specifically controlled for total caloric intake. So if we look at another set of studies, if you control for the total energy content of the diet, and you now look at the overall effect, there's no overall effect. P is 0.33. So adding sugar to your diet makes you fat if it increases your calorie intake. If you balance out for calories, there's no evidence that adding sugar to your diet increases your tendency to become fat. And I could have shown you an exactly equivalent set of results for adding fat to the diet. So, just to end, because I've got 25 seconds left, my messages are, in order to communicate about science, we have to communicate about scientific evidence, the nature of evidence, and the uncertainties that lie in the evidence. And this is true not just of communicating about food, but of any issue that has a scientific basis, whether it's climate change, loss of biodiversity, plastic pollution in the oceans, and so on. So I think we're very lucky in this country to have an outstanding group of science journalists, and I hope that with those science journalists and with other communicators, we can introduce balanced messages about the risks and benefits of the food we eat, rather than distorted messages of the kind that I showed you earlier on in this lecture. Thank you.